hard work right now.
Yeah.
Hi, and welcome to Ask an Archaeologist. I'm Sarah Kanza, the host of today's interview. Ask an Archaeologist is a series of live-streamed interviews co-hosted by the Archaeological Research Facility and the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. During each program, we hear from UC Berkeley affiliated archaeologists and answer audience questions. So you can submit your questions if you have any in the live chat box on YouTube anytime during this interview, and we'll pose them to our speaker. So today's episode is episode 27 of Ask an Archaeologist, and it is How I Became a Reformed Biblical Archaeologist with Professor Aaron Brody. So welcome to the show, Aaron.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Great, thanks for coming. Aaron Brody is the Robert and Kathryn Riddell Professor of Bible and Archaeology, and Director of the Badè Museum of Biblical Archaeology in Berkeley, California. He's studied and worked on projects in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, and traveled extensively throughout the Middle East and the Mediterranean. He has held research posts at both the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, the University of Haifa, and the American Center of Oriental Research in Amman, Jordan. Recently, his research has focused on household archaeology, household religion, metallurgy, ethnicity, identity, and interregional trade in the at Tel en-Nasbeh, the site that forms the principal holdings of the Badè Museum at the Pacific School of Religion, as modes for understanding the complexities of everyday life and ancient biblical peoples, of the ancient biblical peoples, sorry. So Aaron, we're very happy to have you on the show today and to hear about your work.
Nice to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
So to get started, perhaps could you just give us sort of a background of your journey in archaeology and how you first got interested in studying archaeology?
Well, like a lot of things, I both blame and thank my parents. I'm the son of an academic, and when I was 4 years old, we were on a sabbatical based in Holland. But, this was 1970 in Europe. And so my parents, like to travel. They like to visit archaeological sites and museums. And so it had a huge impression on me as a very young child. I have a shirt collection from when I was 4. So I'd like to say it was a straight path, but it wasn't quite. But I think that really cemented a lot of early interests in archaeology, in landscape, in interactions with foreign cultures, both modern and ancient. And so it sort of laid the foundations. Yeah.
And do you have siblings who that also happened to, or did they have an opposite experience?
I have 2 older brothers. Let's see, my eldest brother actually started off as a classical archaeology major at UC Santa Barbara, but eventually switched to pre-med. So, I think like with a lot of folks who are interested, there are many times along the path when one can step off the path. I think, again, he's interested, but, he didn't devote his profession to it. And my middle brother's an architect. So again, I think these things probably had influences in his own, designs and that sort of thing, but, not strictly as a profession. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What a fun experience to be able to have as a kid.
Yeah, no, it's unbelievably just feel very privileged. Right.
And so how did you get interested specifically in the Middle East?
Well, that was also a little bit of a circuitous route. I actually did my undergraduate work at UC Berkeley, and I got to Cal and was interested in archaeology and maybe art history, but as maybe some other 18-year-olds do on a whim, my roommate said something about a scuba diving class at Cal, and I thought, oh, underwater archaeology, that sounds cool. And so I did the class, became certified as an open water diver. It's a class that specifically trains mostly researchers at Cal how to do underwater, well, how to work with their equipment, but how to do underwater research really safely. and I started to look around for where one could study underwater archaeology. And as an undergraduate, it's extremely limited still, even after all this time. And it turned out that one of the programs was at the University of Haifa in Israel. And also, sort of by kismet, turned out that a family friend was running the overseas program. And so I wrote him a handwritten letter back in the day and said, dear Mark, I'm interested. What do you think? And he wrote me back and he said, sounds great. I've signed you up for the junior year abroad. So yeah, it just sort of fell into my lap.
That's fun. So as an undergrad, you were able to go on your junior year abroad to Haifa and specifically study underwater archaeology?
Yes, and aspects related. The program in Haifa is actually maritime archaeology related, so it's a little less specific. But really what sealed the deal was that I got to do my first field work. And ironically, it wasn't underwater. It was on harbor sites. So I could see the water from my excavation squares. But it was the field work that really convinced me that I wanted to pursue a career in Near Eastern archaeology.
That's great. And did you end up doing underwater archaeology at some point?
Just a tiny bit. Worked on some shipwreck excavation, actually along the coast of Israel, near Tel Dor, a place called Tantura Lagoon. But I did manage to actually spend most of my career working on coastal sites. So again, it's not underwater, but with a kind of maritime focus. And most of those sites have been or are on the coast of modern day Israel. Mm-hmm. And it always influenced my research as well, the research questions I was asking. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about the differences between excavating on land and how an underwater excavation works in terms of like collecting samples and the workday? What is that like?
Some of the principles apply, and then there are a lot of differences. So of course, underwater you're limited in time by the scuba equipment. Instead of a trowel and a pottery basket and things like that, you usually have like a giant suction hose. And but you're supposed to be digging in squares and recording things by level, and so some of the stratigraphic principles apply and the methodologies apply, but depending on how deep you're going, individual excavators can only be down sometimes underwater for fewer than 15 minutes. So you have to have a kind of a team doing it in shifts. And actually, in some ways, those very early lessons helped convince me that it might have been easier to work on land than underwater. But again, it was the ideas that kind of captured me, not just maritime archaeology, but the interconnectivity of ancient peoples, fascinated me. And in some ways, that's less represented by underwater archaeology, which is primarily focused on shipwreck archaeology. I mean, you can have settlements that are subsided underwater, or you can excavate harbor sites that are underwater, but still the majority of underwater work that goes on is on shipwrecks, and that's a much more limited kind of focus.
Right. Interesting. Well, so can you tell us about your current field work?
Oh, sure. Well, I'm affiliated with Excavations at a harbor site called Tel Akko in the northern part of Israel. Although I'm actually able to get into the field much less frequently than before, just because of family responsibilities and other kinds of considerations that didn't affect me when I was 18 or 19, but have settled in.
Right, and currently with the pandemic, nobody's going to the field, so we're all on hold.
Yeah, absolutely. But honestly, so since coming to Pacific School of Religion in 2002, I've mostly been digging in the basement in our museum holdings. And so it's a different kind of of work and a different set of processes, but I found it to be meaningful in different ways.
Great. Well, so can you talk a little bit about what is in the basement at the Badè Museum, and
Sure.
what kinds of work has been done with that material over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's see. So my predecessor, W.F. Badè, who taught at Pacific School of Religion and was in Berkeley from 1902 to 1936, towards the end of his career, decided to excavate a site in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. And so, again, sort of true to the title for this talk, he was very biblically informed, chose a site that was being argued about in the scholarly literature, primarily over what was its ancient identification. So what was the sort of biblical name of this, site, or and chose one of the two that was being argued about and excavated it between 1926 to 1935 in 5 different seasons.
Mm-hmm.
And so, following the laws of the time, he was able to export about half the materials that he excavated to Berkeley. And so that's the principal holdings we have. There are a few other smaller collections. But to me, what the real treasure trove is that we have all the original documentation from this project. So it's this legacy excavation, but we have all of the original architectural plans, photographs, notes, et cetera, et cetera. So with some caveats, we can still do contextual research on the collection today because of the amazing work that he did back in the 20s and 30s.
And would you say that, I mean, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but would you say that that was unusual to be so meticulous about documentation and to have saved that much and actually have it still associated with the collection?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, unfortunately, Badè passed away about 6 months after the project was finished.
Wow.
To the credit of his New Testament colleague at the school, Chester McCowan, took up the reins, and the materials were still processed and published, which is pretty amazing. But one of the things that Badè did publish actually is one of the earliest field manuals of excavation for the Middle East or the Near East. And so through that, you really get into the world of what it was like to dig in the 1920s and 30s. But the fact that he actually put it down on paper shows his meticulous nature, and that sort of rippled through the different layers of the different experts and how things were not only dug, but also recorded and then, of course, preserved.
Right. That's amazing because, yeah, we rarely have that kind of metadata type stuff associated with the collections in museums. How fabulous. So do you think that careful documentation has really helped the collection to be usable by people doing research?
Yes, absolutely. So of course, it's since arriving in 2002, the collection has been the focus of my research. So I kind of crawled up onto land from the seashore. The reason why it's been meaningful is because of my ability to put things into context. But of course, I've also opened up the collection to other researchers, graduate students, undergrad, et cetera. And so most of that research, I would say, is possible, because of the documentation. Mm-hmm. Or I would say without it would be much less meaningful. So it's in some ways, I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do is to breathe new life into the collection. And that's not just revitalizing exhibits and drawing in the public to see things in the museum, but it's also working on what's in the collection, what's behind the scenes, to bring its attention to professionals and the public at large as well. There's still many stories that can be told with that material. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So we have a question. I just want to remind our listeners that they can ask questions by typing them into the chat box on YouTube. And I'm just going to transition to this question that came up, that is asking about the Biblical Archaeology Review. And that it has always seemed to simultaneously embrace modern scientific practice and also hold it at arm's length. And
Right.
if you have any insight into why this is the case?
I could broaden that out to the field in general, because I think that semi-popular or popular magazine really reflects the field at large. And one of the nice things that I would say that's developed in the last 20 years actually is the diversity of interests and researchers and students who have gotten into the field, from landscape archaeology, garden archaeology, prehistory, I mean, et cetera, just across the board. And yet there's still a core who want to see sort of the older fashioned. This is my sort of semi joke about being a reformed biblical archaeologist, who want to see those sorts of questions and agendas being put forth. And so that's a popular magazine. It needs to keep up its readership. And so you get a mix of professionals and semi-professionals writing for it that cover, I would say, every spectrum of our subfield.
And it's a big field. I mean, there's a lot of interest in this topic. Do you see, so when Badè was excavating at Nasbeh, I'm assuming at that time there were lots and lots of excavations going on in Israel and in the region. And do you see that sort of the biblical leanings or whatever of the time period reflected in the way he collected the data that ended up at the museum? Or do you see sort of the
I would
colors
say
of the period on the collection?
Absolutely. I would say probably less in the way he collected it, but more in what his focus interests were, and then subsequent focus interests. Mm-hmm. So my kind of pet peeve about the field in general is where the questions are coming from. And so I prefer to take, kind of anthropological kinds of questions and apply it to even this legacy material, the older material, in terms of my work on the, household archaeology, or questions about identity, or about metallurgy, things like that. But there's still, again, it's not just Badè. There's still plenty of current colleagues who are using our ancient textual sources to really frame the questions that they're asking of the archaeology or the material culture. I still have the firm opinion that it's very rare for textually based questions to be able to be answered through material culture or through excavation. So,
well, that actually ties nicely to another question from a listener, which says that you mentioned new stories to be told with these early collections. And can you elaborate on that and how archaeologists use museum collections to reinterpret the past?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll very selfishly just talk about some of my own specific research as an example. I don't have any pictures, but anyway, the site that we're talking about in what archaeologists would call the late Iron Age, biblical historians would call it the time of the divided monarchies. So this is approximately, 875 to 586 BCE. So at that time, the site of Tel en-Nasbeh is a large village, population about 850 to 1,000. It is walled, which is unusual for a village, but inside those walls, I can't even call it a city, because all you have are a bunch of common households. So there's no monumental architecture, there's no public architecture. And so that's why it's been interpreted as being a large village. And I think that's a correct interpretation. Well, from that particular time period, the daily lives of villagers are very rarely mentioned in textual sources, which tend to focus on, and not just biblical sources, but extra biblical textual sources. When you think about it, literacy was in the purview of the elite. Very few people could read or write. That's true until very modern times in global history. And so letting those common people speak for themselves through their material remains, I think can help us rewrite history. To put it in modern parlance, it would be like trying to write a history of the 99% in the US instead of the 1%, right? So but those voices of the 99% for the ancient world are largely mute. They're not represented in textual sources. So one has to use archaeology to represent those voices. So.
Great. And do you have the work that goes on with the collections at the museum? Do you display that? And I know so I want to make a plug for the Badè Museum. First of all, if you are in the Berkeley area, the Badè Museum is in this lovely building just next to UC Berkeley campus on the north side, and you should visit it. Maybe Aaron can tell us the opening hours, but it's just a beautiful space, and you have exhibits that turn over occasionally, right? So could you describe that space and how you've used it?
So we're housed at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, 1798 Scenic Avenue. I do want to say though we are closed right now because of the pandemic, so keep an eye on our and plan actually to be closed to the public. I would say through the fall semester of 2020, but do stay tuned. So yes, we have a number of exhibits. One of the things that we've been working on since shelter in place is trying to make more of our resources available online. I know that it's not a substitute, but hopefully, if you can find our website, you can see some of our resources, get a little bit of an entree to the collection. And then it'd be wonderful once the pandemic is over, inshallah, as they say, that you can come and visit in person as well and see exhibits mostly related to, again, the daily lives of these biblical people. The things that aren't written about, like I said, in most of our biblical texts.
Mm-hmm. And so you have an exhibit about the collection that is sort of a permanent exhibit that people can come and see a sampling of what the pottery and that kinds of stuff. What kinds of holdings do you have in the Nasbay collection? Is it mostly pottery?
Let's see. Well, yeah, like a lot of excavations, because of the climate, most of what's preserved is pottery. But we've got a wide variety of ancient metals, stone vessels, chipstone wares. Let's see, we even have some animal bones, Sarah, and
my thing.
So it's a wide variety of different materials, and we tend to display things following different themes of daily life, and then also introduce the visitor to concepts of archaeology. So how we even get these things that we, these mute objects that we need to read, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. A question from the audience is asking, do many students and researchers make use of your collections? Can you describe any recent projects that students have done?
Let's see. I would say, fewer students. Let's see. We have a number of current work that is going on. I mean, I've been continuing to do my own work focused on notions around ritual in these households. We have several Israeli researchers who are looking at more general questions about things like the Persian period or the Hellenistic period at the site and how it represents the region at large. There's a researcher from SF State who's looking, asking anthropological questions actually of our photography collection. That is photos that were taken during the project. Let's see, what else is going on? Recent work on the female figurines. There's another Israeli researcher who's doing provenience studies, petrography of ceramics from a wide point of view of the collection. So it's fairly varied. Yeah.
Yeah. How many female figurines are there from the excavation?
Funny you should ask. No, so we have it's a sort of hot topic in the archaeology of the region. These female pillar figurines are called. And interestingly enough, for a small village site, we have the second largest collection after Jerusalem. So after all these decades of, or hundreds of years of digging in Jerusalem, I think there are fewer than 500 examples from Jerusalem. We have, the count varies, but somewhere between 140 to 180 examples from our little 3-hectare site. So,
wow. So can you comment on that, or is that a subject of ongoing research that you're not able to discuss?
Well, yeah, it also touches on my research, so I'll talk about that, because these female figurines that were probably, some aspect of religion. We don't exactly know what, but have religious ties. Were clearly being used in conjunction with other ritual objects, typically for concerns that affected these extended families and households. So Carol Myers, who teaches at Duke University, has done some wonderful studies relating these female figurines to women's religious culture. And again, just as sort of tying into one of the earlier questions, those are things that tend not to be talked about in terms of our biblical texts. As a matter of fact, in the official texts, which tend to be, not just elite, but also very male focused, these kinds of things tend to be either frowned upon or even, talked about in very negative terms. But of course, it doesn't mean if things are forbidden that they weren't going on. And so, and you can think of a host of different things, and they probably were being used by the head female of these households to help protect not only herself, but the ritual needs of her extended family.
Yeah, that's fascinating. If you have publications or any links that you can point to that talk about this research that's being done on the Badè's collections, feel free to send them to me, and then we can put them in the description of your video here, so future viewers can follow some links to see what's been done.
I'll put in a brief plug. So all of my work is published also on my academia.edu website, so you can follow up there as well.
Great. Well, we have a few more minutes and a couple more questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to go to this next one, which is, this person is curious to know if you've had a chance to read this week's article in the New Yorker, In Search of King David's Lost Empire, and if so, what you thought of it and its presentation of the field of biblical archaeology over the decades. And I don't know if you're.
I actually did read that article, so yeah.
Lucky.
I think it's very representative of where Israeli archaeologists are with these questions, and especially representative of an older generation of Israeli archaeologists. But my takeaway is that, again, even in the title, it's about King David's King David's empire. And so there are already some problematic things. I don't think King David really had an empire, if he even existed, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it gets to the core of what I was mentioning before, which is that if you're trying to use archaeology to reconstruct, the history or the life of an individual, like a King David, most of the time it just can't be done, because these are people who had very short-term lives. And so short-term history is just awful to try and reconstruct from archaeology. But if you ask questions like, even a general question like, was there an ancient state in this region, at this time? That's a little different than did King David, reign, or that sort of thing. So I think we need to ask new questions, even of the older material. Mm-hmm. And ones that are not framed by the Bible.
Mm-hmm. So you've been working in that region for several decades now, I guess, it sounds like. And there's been a lot of sort of many ups and downs, I'd say, politically. Can you comment on how that impacted your work or sort of archaeology in general over time, in terms of,
Sure.
how smoothly excavations can go? And I know a lot of people shifted to working in other countries at one point. So what's sort
Yeah,
of,
and frankly, have shifted back to working in Israel after the Arab Spring.
yep.
So, I mean, I think, this is actually a nice time to memorialize David Stronach,
Mhm.
who just passed away very recently, and who I studied under at Berkeley. And I remember him, I think through his stories about working in Iran and Iraq, and I very quickly picked up on the fact that as someone who wants to do, work in that region, you have to have a plan B, if not even a plan C. And I would say, even within the Levant, that's true as well. If field work is going to be supported, largely by volunteer, which is a slightly different paradigm than work in other countries in the region. Those volunteers aren't going to come, if there are Scud missiles that are coming in from Lebanon, or or an attack from Gaza.
Mhm.
And so, you just have to be both tuned in, but also very flexible. I mean, in some ways, it's like this pandemic. I mean, you
Mhm.
can't ask people to be in harm's way. It's just not. It's not ethical. Um, and yet, I think in a non-colonial way, we can still do meaningful work in the region, and should be doing meaningful work, and also supporting local colleagues who are doing meaningful work. And so I'm all about the flexible model. Now, I'm not running a field project, and so it's a slightly different set of perspectives. But it's a turbulent region, and I think as foreign researchers, we both have to be very tuned into what's going on the ground, but again, like I said, just willing to not do things for the sake of a project that might risk human life, actually.
Right.
Yeah, so very dynamic region.
Mhm. And just to finish up, I wanted to ask you a more personal question about, I know you've traveled a lot with your family, in uh, all over the place, and not necessarily at a field project, but has how has that impacted your sort of experience of archaeology by seeing it through the eyes of your kids?
It's made it a lot more fun again. That's right, when they can go to a site and just start picking up some stones and having fun trying to chip away at them. um, Brings the kid out in me, which is great. But it's also been a lot of fun to be able to share those kinds of experiences that I had as a 4-year-old plus, with my family, from my family to my younger generation, to my own children. And I think it brings an education, and widens experiences that are just so vital, in this strange world that we're living in. Whether it's sort of hyper global or hyper local, being able to navigate those different worlds, I think is vital to at least my kids' education. And so
Mhm.
I've just been thrilled to be able to share that kind of thing, even sort of passively with them, not talking to them too much about it, but just bringing them, letting them have those experiences
Mhm.
that I had in a slightly different world, in the 70s. So yeah, it's
Yeah,
been exciting.
well, we can thank your parents for inspiring you, and thank you for inspiring your children. um,
Hopefully.
well, yeah, we're out of time now. So I want to thank you so much, Aaron, for joining us today to talk about your experience with archaeology. And
Been a pleasure.
yeah, if people can, once things open up again, go visit Aaron at the museum if you have a
That'd be
chance and you're in the area. And thank you to those of you who joined us today on YouTube. And we hope you can join us tomorrow, July 1st. We will have Professor Ted Pena talking about making sense of material culture at Pompeii. So we hope to see you then. And please, if you can fill out the feedback form, that the link is in the description of the video below. When you have a chance, that would be really helpful. Thanks so much.